Now let's talk about process approach. What is process approach? But before we talk about process approach, we need to understand a process. What is a process? Process is an activity or a series or combination of activities which converts your inputs into the output. Don't try to remember this definition, but try to realize this definition. We normally don't have the right realization of process. So an activity or combination of activities which converts your inputs into the output, that is considered as a process. So think about different processes within your organization. Is procurement a process? Is operations a process? Is training a process? The lecture which I'm delivering at the moment, is this considered as a process? Think about it. Think about various different possible processes within your organization. Anything which is having input and anything which is creating an output, that will be considered as a process. So for example, if we consider procurement as one of the processes, then procurement will be having some input and procurement will be having some output. Input is something which basically triggers a process. So from where basically the procurement process is triggered. So procurement process is triggered from the requirement itself. When somebody raises a requirement, that's the starting point for this particular process. So maybe in some organizations, the requirement is communicated verbally. In some organizations, maybe a purchase requisition is raised. So whatever methodology you are following, that starting point will be considered as your input. So procurement input, if my organization is having purchase requisition as a starting point for purchasing process, that will be considered as my input. Now, what's the output of the procurement process? Think about it. The output of the procurement process is the procured product itself, right? So you have input, you have output. There might be multiple activities in between. So an activity or combination of activities which is converting your inputs into the output, that is called a process. So procurement I am considering as a process. So in one organization, there are many different processes. In one department, in one function, there might be multiple processes. Like if you think about the finance department, finance might be having various different processes. Although it's one department, but within one department, they are having different processes, different outputs are needed, different inputs are there, and different activities are performed. So multiple processes are there within one function. So now you're clear that what is a process? Process is an activity or combination of activities which is converting inputs into the output. We consider procurement as one process. Procurement function will be having multiple processes. Maybe supplier evaluation is one process. Supplier selection is a separate process. Maybe the procurement itself is a separate process. So various different processes are under one particular function. So an organization itself is a combination of maybe hundreds of processes, and different organizations will be having different processes. A travel agency will be having different processes. A nuclear plant will be having different processes. Oil and gas companies will be having a different processes. A training service provider will be having a different processes. And if you consider your home, your house as an entity, you will find various different processes at your home as well. So we are talking about something where processes are creating the entities, and we need to focus on those processes. These processes are not isolated. They are not independent. They are completely depending upon each other. Performance of production depends upon the procurement process, how well the material is purchased, how well the services are purchased. So there is an interlink between production and procurement. Performance of procurement itself is not independent. Performance of procurement might be depending upon the performance of the finance department, how well the money is released on time. Performance of sales might be depending upon the performance of marketing. If the right marketing is not done, the sales will not perform well. So keep in mind, these processes are not isolated. These processes are not independent. Now, process is having certain fundamental elements Please remember these elements, because if you do not realize the importance of these elements, the definition of process itself will not be complete. Every process has an input. You cannot change it. Every process has an output. Without output, process will not be considered as a process. In addition to inputs and output, there are three more fundamental factors of a process. What are those three fundamental factors? The first one is resource. Without the right resource, you cannot achieve the desired result. You cannot produce a desired output. So if you are not having the right resource, right people, right competency, right machine, right equipment, right environment, if you don't have that, don't expect that you will produce something which is meeting the expectations of its stakeholders. The second most important component of a process is control. If you have provided all the right resources, the right people are there, the competent people are there, machinery is there, equipment is there, environment is there, raw material is there, finance is there, everything is there. But if you do not control your process properly, the process will not be producing the results as per your desired expectation. Process is just like a horse. If you are sitting on top of the horse, but you don't have any control over that particular horse, you will not be able to reach your destination. You can't just tell the horse that I want to go to this particular place. Horses are not that intelligent as yet. So you need to control the horse. You need to give direction to the horse. If you want to go to a particular direction, if you want to go to a particular place, you need to give direction to the horse. You need to control the horse. So process is just like a horse. You need to establish controls. Those controls could be the procedures, work instructions, job descriptions, physical controls, the machine speed, the temperature, work environment, so many things. There can be a list of thousands and thousands of controls, but who will decide that what controls to be established? You are the best person to decide about those controls. Nobody from an external organization, nobody from outside can tell you what controls you require, because this is your process. You know the process, you know your limitations, you know your competencies, you know what your customer wants, you know what your legal bodies wants, you know what your management wants. So you know the expectations of stakeholders. So you are the best people to identify controls. Now the next factor is monitoring and measurement. This is one of the most important factors, because if you have resources and if you have established controls, how you're going to guarantee that those resources will be used properly and those controls are effectively implemented? You require some sort of monitoring and measurement. Without monitoring and measurement, you will not be able to achieve your targets on consistent basis. You might be able to achieve it once in a while, but once in a while is not the actual expectation you have. So if you want to have consistent output which is meeting all the expectations of stakeholders, you need to have the right monitoring and measurement in place. You need to decide, do you require inspection? Do you require audits? Do you require testing? Do you require calibration? You are the one who will be identifying all these monitoring and measurement needs. Again, exactly in the similar way I said that controls cannot be decided by any external party, monitoring and measurement cannot be also decided by any external stakeholder. You are the best people. You know your requirements, you know your expectations, and you know your targets, and you know your goals. So you are the best people to decide what sort of monitoring and measurement you require. So now you realize these are the fundamental components of a process. Input is one of the fundamental component, output is one of the fundamental component, resource is one of the fundamental component, control is one of the fundamental component, and monitoring and measurement is one of the fundamental component. Never ever forget these basic fundamental components of a process. Now, what is process approach? Process approach means treat your activities as a process. What do we mean by that? You have a procurement activity. If you treat it as an activity, you only know these are the steps of doing procurement, right? If you have a marketing activity, you will consider that these are the steps of marketing. That's the way marketing is done. That's it. If you have a production activity, you will only consider these are the steps to complete the production process. That's it. But the moment you treat these activities as a process, so many questions will arise in your mind. Just try once. Think about production activity and try to think from the point of view of a process. The moment you will consider that this is not merely an activity, it's a process, so many questions will jump into your mind. If it's a process, what is the input for production? If it's a process, what is the output of production? If it's an output, if it's a process, what will be the requirements related to the output? Who are the stakeholders? What do they demand? What are the customer requirements? What are the legal requirements? So output requirements you will consider. Then once input and output is clear in your mind, then your mind will be asking so many more questions. What sort of resources I require? What sort of controls I should establish? And what sort of monitoring and measurement I should put in place? It's an amazing concept. The moment you change your thinking from activity to a process, that becomes a process approach, and that's what basically ISO 9000 is all about. ISO 9000 is nothing more than the concept of process approach. But the problem is that within ISO 9000 standard is not mentioning anywhere that you have to effectively implement process approach. The components are taken and they are defined as requirements, but people get confused. They do not effectively implement this holistic approach within the organization. They try to implement those components only. And at some places, the integration exists, and in most of the places, most of the organization, integration doesn't exist. Now, what is integration? When I say integration, it means that everything is connected. You cannot simply implement the clauses in isolation, that I am implementing clause 4 without looking into other clauses. I am implementing clause 5 without looking into other clauses. I am auditing clause 6 without looking into other clauses. That is absolutely not possible. But this is happening. People are implementing clauses in isolation, and auditors are doing audit these clauses in isolation. And that's the place where we have messed up with the concept of process approach and the fundamentals behind ISO 9001 standard. So please, this is my humble request. Whenever you read ISO 9000 standard, keep in your mind that this standard is promoting process approach, and the structure of the standard is based upon that fundamental concept. We will end our today's session here. And in the next session, we will be discussing about the risk-based thinking, which is newly introduced in ISO 9001. Until 2008, it was, before 2015 version, it was based upon only process approach. In 2015 version, ISO introduced risk-based thinking as well. So we will discuss about the risk-based thinking in our next episode. Thank you very much for watching, and kindly spread the word to those people who really needs it. This particular series is not for everyone. I'm not addressing to all the people who have no knowledge about ISO standards. I am addressing only those people who knows about ISO standards, but they have misconceptions and they are not effectively implementing the ISO standards. So if you want to learn something about the ISO standard, the real fundamental concepts, please follow the series.